Welcome to the Institute for Astronomy. I'm really happy to see all these folks here today. The most important thing that exactly existential education is. And that's why we have Dr. Jeff Kuhn. He's a physicist, an astronomer, professor at UH, been here almost 20 years and more than 10 years on Maui. I could go on, but let's not delay this and get started. Jeff is an amazing man, very knowledgeable. Whatever the subject is, he can cover it. Welcome. Do you want to take this?
How are we doing, Sivan? That works? Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the IFA. We do strange and unusual things here. Most of them are related to astronomy, and so you can look at this title and wonder, what does that have to do with astronomy? So I'll spend a little less than 15 minutes trying to explain what that means. I guess I could start off with a question to you. How long would you like to be here? Okay. I don't really mean you, personally. What I mean is our species, are part of the ecological chain that we call Homo sapiens. We're approaching a time in science where we may be able to begin to answer that question. And so I want to give you a broad picture of how we're trying to understand what the likelihood of our survivability is. And the interesting part of that answer is that it could involve things related to astronomy. So I don't have a lot of time. It's a big subject. At the end, we may have a little bit of time for questions. And if you're intrigued by the subject, you can catch me. I'll be here most of the night, and we can talk some more about it. So the subtitle to this talk is, how long can we expect to be around? Not us personally, but our part of the ecology. And so let's get the definition of education out of the way. In simple terms, education is transgenerational information transfer. Well, not really simple terms. That is, education for us is all about taking the things that we learn and passing them on to the next generation, right? That's what we care about. And in particular, we do that to increase what we would call the survivability of the next generation or our offspring. So that's what I mean by education. Taking information and passing it from one generation to the next. And that's really important, right? Because the long-term existence of our species depends on this ability to train survivability into future generations. And of course, that's what I mean when I say existential education. Our existence into the future on a long time scale depends on our ability to pass information from now to future generations. And the interesting point that we're just learning is that information, so this talk is all going to come together in this idea of what information is and what it means. But information is a universal civilization biomarker. Another set of big words. But what those words mean is that now that we know the universe is filled with planets, not so different than the Earth, planets that probably have water and may not be very special compared to us, we can begin to ask the question, are there biomarkers, are there signals that tell us that there's life out there that help us understand how long we might be here, actually? That's this question of survivability. Okay, so education is also for us important because it tells us about perspective. So perspective is this idea that we don't just see the world from our own personal experience, but we see the world from a bigger vantage point. And one of those vantage points is over time. We don't really have a good idea of time except what we've learned through scientific enterprise. So just real quickly, let me remind you of the cosmic timeline that we know and understand from other scientific observations. Here we are over here. Here's the beginning of the universe about 14 billion years ago. long time. But we know about that because we can look at distant galaxies and we can see when they all were on top of one another. And there was a big bang because we can extrapolate their motion and we know how fast they're moving. And they were all on top of one another about 14 billion years ago. That was the Big Bang. There's an important milestone which was about 5 billion years. So G stands for giga, which is the same as billion. About 5 billion years ago, the sun was formed in the solar system. And the sun at that time was actually fainter than it is now. It's about 30% fainter, which is an interesting number and a subject for another talk. Life formed billion to 2 billion years later, as far as we can tell. The earliest forms of life that we know about, and we'll talk about in a minute, were cyanobacteria, and they appeared in early oceans about 3.8 billion years ago. Complex life, so life composed of many cells cooperating to form animals and plants, didn't happen until about 500 million years ago. And if you take this little stretch and you spread it out, right, we can then expand to see that trilobites and things like that, that was what I mean by complex life 500 million years ago, which was 500 million years ago. And then the dinosaurs were about 250 million years ago. And then something happened. Dinosaurs were around for almost 200 million years, and then mammals, and the age of mammals dates back from 60 million years ago. And then in the thickness of this line, let's expand this, we had the development of creatures that we think were our early ancestors, creatures that walked on two legs, the hominids. And then if we look at the very end of this line, our species, Homo sapiens, emerged maybe 100,000, 200,000 years ago. And what we think of as civilization only is the thickness of this line, which is about 10,000 years. Okay? So we don't really have a lot of data about the history of the universe, except for what we learned from the thickness of this line, which was expanded from here, which was expanded from here, which was all of that period of time. Okay? So we're kind of a little blip in the history of the universe. Maybe not very important, but we think we're important. We can ask the question from the standpoint of modern civilization, how long do we think we'll be here? There's an organization of scientists that produce a journal called the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and at midnight life ceases, and at various times they've said, well, we've got about 5 minutes to midnight. Well, that's symbolic. It used to be that we weren't going to live very long because we were going to annihilate ourselves by nuclear holocaust. Now the Bulletin of American Scientists doesn't refer to this as our demise, but we're going to screw things up because of global warming. It's a journal meant to advertise a pessimistic view of our future, which I don't actually share. I'm really an optimist. But it's kind of hard to be an optimist when you look back at the history of all fossils that we know about and all life forms that we know about. So for example, you know what we just mentioned was the extinction of the... So this is a graph that shows time before the present and the number of fossils that have ceased to appear, that have vanished. So we have a record of extinctions by counting fossil forms as a function of time, and we can date the rocks. And they're extreme periods of extinction. So we think about the extinction, and maybe you've heard the story that it was probably a comet that struck the Earth 60 million years ago that changed the climate so the dinosaurs couldn't survive, which allowed us to develop. Otherwise, the dinosaurs were really successful. They'd been around for 200 million years. Mammals have only been around for 60 million years. This extinction wiped out 75% of all life that we know about, all species. That wasn't even the big one. There was one about 260 million years ago that wiped out 95% of all species. So when we think about chances of surviving over millions of years, the odds are against us. We don't actually know what the origin of these extinctions are. We think this was a comet. This might have been another comet. Some astronomical event that changed, we say suddenly, but changed over a period of probably 1 million years or so, the probability of life going on. So from the perspective of just the chances to survive, it ain't very good if you look back at the history of life. And there are many periods of these extinctions. How can I be an optimist? Especially when we look at the history of the hominids. So this is present, and this is about 4.5 billion years ago. And from the fossil record, each one of these is a different, call it, shape and form for two-legged creatures. Here we are out here, Homo sapiens. We've been around, as I said, for only 100 or 200,000 years. We coexisted with Neanderthals. Who was more successful at living? The Neanderthals. They actually survived twice as long as we have. And there were other hominid species that survived even longer, a few million years. But the message from this is that even two-legged creatures haven't been all that successful at surviving for certainly more than 1 million years. A million years on this graph is this far. And we're a long way from demonstrating our ability to survive. So the other message that we know about is that civilizations, cultures, are even more fragile than these species. And we know that because as we look back in time, there are lots of examples of cultural sediments that have just vanished. So the Mogollon, the Anasazi, the Hohokam, the southwestern Pueblo cultures dating back almost 1,000 years vanished. And they were around for hundreds of years. You may know that the Viking settlements on the western coast of Greenland at one point were planting crops, and they had an agrarian civilization, and they lived for several hundred years. And they vanished. They didn't exist. We think we know what the origin of a lot of these emergence and death of civilizations can be traced to. Climate change. We know by looking at the sun that the sun is a little bit warmer when it has lots of dark sunspots, paradoxically. And during roughly the 1300s, the Chinese recorded sunspots on the sun even before we had telescopes. They watched the sun as it came to the horizon, and they could see dark spots. So we know the sun was different back then. And we believe from modern observations that when there are lots of sunspots, the sun is warmer, and the warmer the sun is, the warmer the earth is. So the ability to cultivate the western coast of Greenland was because the climate was much warmer then than it is now. The death of the western Pueblo cultures probably was also caused by that warm period. Drought and very hot conditions in the southwest led to the demise of those Pueblo cultures. So it's quite likely that civilization is even more fragile, and it's tied to these tiny changes in this case, in the sun, astrophysical mechanisms, we would say. The global warming that we worry about today is actually much smaller than the temperature changes that have been seen into the past. So what does it take to survive? What is the most successful life form on the earth at surviving? Who does better than we do? It's these bacteria. That's the cyanobacteria. We find fossils, as I said, that date back 3.8 billion years. They have survived longer than anything we know about. They're much more successful than any of these complex life forms. So you ask, what is the chance then that we're going to survive? What's it going to take when most everybody has been wiped out? The most robust life forms on our planet have been the simplest. They can resist and they can adapt to changes in the climate brought on by comets or by changes in the temperature of the sun. Probably the answer depends on whether or not you believe that we're special. I mean, we're trained from the time we're born. Our parents make us believe we're special, right? That's part of the aging process, is learning gradually that, well, maybe we're not so special as our parents thought we were, right? That's one definition for aging, learning that you're not special. Maybe the same thing is true of culture and civilization as we get older. And I got to show you some more graphs now. So a few years ago, a biologist and mathematician, said, well, what's the real education process that nature provided us with before we had schools and textbooks? Well, it was our DNA. Our survivability information was transmitted by the information that was encoded in the DNA that we pass on from one generation to the next. And you may know that that information is encoded, right, in nucleotides, and there are 4 of them. And the amount of information we can actually count because we know how many nucleotides are in a strand of DNA. You know how long a strand of DNA is in our bodies, if you could stretch it out? It's 6 feet long. Single molecule. 6 feet long, and it has billions of pairs of these nucleotides to basically write an alphabet that tells your kids how to survive. So we can count the amount of information that goes from one generation to the next, the education that nature has provided to us. And the interesting fact is that as we look back in time at the species that existed, we can estimate how long or how much information they were able to pass from one generation to the next by looking at how long their DNA sequence was. So, for example, we find worm fossils back 1 and a bit billion years, and we know from worms, modern day worms, if they haven't changed too much, how much DNA, useful DNA and information there is. And there's this interesting relationship that as you go back in time, about every 200 million years, the amount of information you pass in your biological education to your offspring doubles. So there's a doubling time. That's called an exponential curve, and the doubling time is a couple 100 million years. Here we are out here with, so counting the number, these are called base pairs, counting the number of base pairs tells how much information we teach our offspring biologically. And the number is 1 followed by almost 10 zeros. So it's about 10 billion base pairs of information are in your genetic sequence. As you go back in time to early and earlier life forms, what do you think happens to the DNA? It gets shorter, fewer base pairs. And the earliest life forms that we know about, the prokaryotes here, have about 10 to the 5, 10 to the 5 is 1 followed by 5 zeros, 100,000 base pairs. So there's a natural progression in the emergence of life towards more complex life, and therefore more information that we educate our offsprings with. The interesting fact is to ask, if we extrapolated this back to what we might think is the emergence of life, how far back do we go to where there's just 1 base pair? The answer is a period of time which is longer than the age of the Earth. All right, I'm not going to talk about that, but you might think about it. How can it be that if life is this continuous evolution of complexity, that it apparently, if you extrapolate backward, takes a period of time longer than the age of the Earth? Some people have interpreted this to mean that life didn't start here. Life started in the universe and was introduced by cosmic events that brought life forms that developed elsewhere. There's a similar development of evolution of the complexity of information that we can talk about. Suppose we measured all of the bits of information on the Earth. Take all the information in your cell phones, everything that the IRS has on us, everything at the National Security Agency, the NSA, take all of that data and ask how it's growing with time. Well, it's the same kind of progression. It's this exponential progression. But instead of a doubling time of millions of years, you know what the doubling time is, the amount of information on the Earth is? It's about 2 to 3 years. So we're now in an age where if you were to extrapolate that line, that this would say that technology emerged for digital recording, or actually books, back, say, in the 1700s, which isn't too bad from our historical perspective, right? So this idea of the evolution of complexity following an exponential curve is a general idea about how complexity evolves in time. Okay, so here's the rub. The worldwide digital information will soon exceed the sum total of all of the brain capacities of all of the people now on the earth. So we can take the number of neurons that we have in our brain and we can ask how many bits of information, like computer bits, we can store, and it's a pretty big number. It's 1 followed by 16 zeros. But as I showed you on this curve before, we're already up to, and this curve is I mean, this is just a straight line. That's only 50 years. Within 50 years, we're going to be up to 10 to the 25 bytes of information that we have recorded, far exceeding the total amount of brain power that exists in Homo sapiens. And these numbers are already exceeding the amount of biological information that we pass from us to our offspring. So what is that saying about education? It doesn't have a lot to do with biology anymore. Survivability is all about the transfer of information from one generation to the next. And what's more devastating is to realize that our biological capacity is not increasing, and that the future evolution of Homo sapiens is somehow going to be inextricably intertwined with somehow this artificial digital age of information. I already feel it. I can't use my cell phone properly. Life is changing. So up through the history of the universe till about now, education has been managed by nature. Over the last 100 years, education is now being managed by us and that transfer. So what does that have to do with astronomy? It has to do with astronomy, and I'm almost done. Because moving information around involves power. And we now know, and I won't go through this diagram, but the total amount of power that we use to manipulate information is 10% of all the power we use on the planet. And we are on the verge of being able to build telescopes that can find examples of civilization just from their use of power on nearby planets. And the answer to understanding our evolution is astronomical. We need to look out into space, find examples where evolution has surpassed this transition that we're facing, and realizing from that yes, there is survivability beyond where we are now, because it's no longer biological. It's in our hands to decide how that happens, both for education and for the use of information that we process. That's my message. Thanks for listening.